I'm Jason Klom, and this is Comedy on Vinyl. The year is 1974, also 1982, the albums Buck Buffalo and Feed and Mingle with Live Indians. The artists are Williams and Rhee. My guest this week is Kliph Nesteroff. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey man, how are you?
I am delighted to have you back. We're here specifically to promote a book called We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, The Unheralded Story of Native Americans in Comedy. Figure I should give it the full title. Let's talk about this. I have been interested in native comedy for a long time, and I'm just so happy that you gave me the thickest primer possible on the subject. So tell me why you got interested in it first.
Well, I live in Hollywood, California, but I'm originally from Canada. And in Canada, First Nations issues are front page news every day, you know. And when I moved to California, I noticed that Native American issues are never front page news here, or very rarely. It took about 4 or 5 years after I moved here for Standing Rock to become a national news story. And that was the first time since I lived here that there really was attention being paid to indigenous concerns, native protest, and so on and so forth. And so I think things are changing a little bit since Standing Rock in terms of awareness, at least among young people in America, not so much among older people. When I told people what I was working on, this new book about indigenous peoples in comedy, people that were like 50 and over just couldn't grasp what I was doing or why, and it just mystified them. But people that were in their 20s immediately grasped it and were on board. So I think there was a bit of a generational divide. But if you look at major Canadian media, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, CBC, go to their websites and you look at the top of the page. They have tabs for each genre of news. So it'll be Canadian news, international news, sports, business, Indigenous. There's always an Indigenous tab.
Awesome.
And
okay.
CBC employs, I think, over 100 different Indigenous journalists. How many does CNN employ? How many does NBC or the New York Times or the LA Times employ? I don't know. It's probably zero, maybe one, you know, or they'll hire a freelancer to do an editorial about Standing Rock or something like that.
Yeah. But
it's very absent. So in America, where race is always being discussed, and where in Hollywood, where the phrase diversity is always being used, it just seems strange to me, coming from a place where Indigenous issues were in your face to a place where Indigenous issues were erased completely. So that was, in a small way, part of the motivation of doing this book.
I mean, there's I think it's an active attempt at erasure that, you know, hey, if we don't talk about them, eventually we won't have to admit our country's biggest shame. And it's sad. It's pathetic. It then denies that these people who are forced to be put onto certain lands, forced to be live certain lives, are then, you know, we just slowly wipe them out. And
and the next thing you know, you're doing a podcast and it's a white host and a white guest and no native guests, you know.
Big
the next thing you know.
Yeah, I'm aware. Boy, oh boy, super fun. Well, I'm glad you wrote the book. You told me, because again, I kind of was only able to crack the book today. You told me to concentrate on these two gentlemen. So your chapters, by the way, it's not as though one subject is within a single chapter. How is the book divided? What's your thoughts on why you divided it the way you did?
Oh, these are not interesting answers to give because it's so like
matter. I'm interested.
Well, it's a publisher thing. The publisher decides. The editor told me to read a book called The Unwinding by George Packer, which goes from present to past, present to past, present to past.
Okay.
Where a number of contemporary characters appear and then disappear and then reappear.
Interesting.
And so that's how he wanted to structure this book. So it's a combination of history and also the stories of contemporary Native comedians who are making a go of things today. So the book starts off in the present, then we go back to the past, then back to the present, to the past, to the present, to the past. That's how it's structured. Okay. And it was not like an idea that I was had any opinion about one way or the other in terms of structure. When it comes to structuring a book, I defer to the editor because that's what they have done their whole lives. And this is only my second book, and I really am just faking it. I don't really know how to write a book, so whatever the editor suggests, unless it's real egregious, I'll be like, yeah, okay, let's try that. So seems to have worked. People seem to appreciate it. But this record, these two records that I've chosen for your show, are really because they're the only comedy records made by anybody that's in this book, any vinyl LPs, at least. So that's why I chose Williams and Rhee and told you to read about them, so you'd have some context for who they are and what these records are. I'm not favoring anybody in the book over anybody else, but these are the dudes who actually put out a comedy LP or three back in the day.
Mm-hmm. And at least self-released the first one, at least, if not the other ones. I'm not 100% sure, but at least the first one.
Yeah, they're a combination of vanity pressings and basically vanity pressings. These are records that they would sell at their gigs, which, as you know, as a comedy record collector, was very common, and you can always tell which records were sold at somebody's gig because it's somebody you've never heard of, and it's always autographed, right?
Oh, big time.
So these fall into that category. If you were to find a Williams and Rhee LP in a thrift store, chances are it's going to be autographed.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of. I think I have one on the way, and I'm hoping it is autographed. Frankly,
and those autographs are so meaningful to people that you can find them in thrift stores all across America.
The worst is when they're personalized, and then I feel worse. You just made this person waste their time and tell you a little story on the sleeve in ballpoint.
Brother, tell me about it. My autographed copies of my first book are all over eBay.
How did you discover Williams and Rhee? Was it a simple came across their name in research, or?
No, I've known who Williams and Rhee are for a long time. To give your listeners context, they are a comedy team. One of them is white, one of them is Native American, and they have been together. I'm assuming they're still together in the times of the coronavirus. So obviously, nobody's performing, but they have been performing live on the road for 52 consecutive years. 5-2. That is longer than anybody else in comedy. Like, it's crazy. The Smothers Brothers are retired.
Yeah.
Williams and Rhee have been doing it since 1968, doing a version of the same act, basically, right to the present day. I learned about them, not quite 20 years ago. There was a cheap DVD collection put out of the very first stand-up comedy series ever made. It was called Norm Crosby's Comedy Shop, and you can now watch it on Amazon Prime, I think. Norm Crosby's Comedy Shop is from 1978. It mostly played UHF stations around the country. It was syndicated, hosted by Norm Crosby, who was an old Ed Sullivan Show comedian, and it showcased new, young comedians mostly, young in those days. So people like Kevin Nealon and Gary Shandling and Brad Garrett, before any of them were famous, they had their TV debuts as a stand-up comic on this show, Norm Crosby's Comedy Shop. Also, some older experienced people would do stand-up, like Marty Allen and Maury Amsterdam, and even the mid-level guys, or midway between being old and young, Gary Muledeer. Anyways, that DVD compilation came out. I rented it back in the days of video stores, and one of the acts on the show was Williams and Rhee. And it was a really weird performance, because it kind of caught me off guard. The thing that they have going for them is not material, but chemistry.
Yeah.
And the key to every great comedy team, whether it's the Marx Brothers or the Kids in the Hall or the Smothers Brothers, is chemistry. Kids in the Hall have this impeccable alchemy when they work together, and the Marx Brothers have this impeccable alchemy when they work together, and the Smothers Brothers have this incredible chemistry when they play off of each other. But if it's just Tommy alone, or just Dick alone, or just Groucho alone, or just Harpo alone, or just Kevin McDonald alone, or just Dave Foley on News Radio, they're still good, but there's a magic there that is lost completely. Maybe Dick Smothers by himself is not good, but other than that, it's still good. So Williams and Rhee have incredible chemistry, and you'd have to if you were on the road together with somebody for 52 years. Sure. And so that was obvious when I saw them on Norm Crosby's Comedy Shop. Their comedy was sort of abstract, but at that time they were living in Los Angeles, and they were regular performers at the Comedy Store on the Sunset Strip, and that's how they got that gig. There was a period where they came in off of the road because they were famous, quote unquote famous, for playing roadhouses all across Nevada. They would play like Jackpot and Elko and Sparks, all the places that were not Las Vegas or Lake Tahoe. And they would play all over South Dakota and Minnesota, places that people developing at the Comedy Store never played, right? Mm-hmm. And then they tried to get on the Tonight Show, so they migrated to Los Angeles in 1977 with 9 years of experience under their belt, way more than anybody else at the Comedy Store, David Letterman, Jay Leno. And so they actually really took off when they started doing the Comedy Store. They were killing all the time, and their fellow comedians were wondering, like, where did these guys come from? Jeff Altman, who was a Comedy Store comedian at that time, told me, he goes, yeah, it was like they came out of nowhere. It looked like they had been doing roadhouses in South Dakota for 10 years, which is exactly what they had been doing. So that's who Williams and Rhee are, and I discovered them from Norm Crosby's Comedy Shop. And then I think I Googled them. This is way before this book was written or conceived, and way before my first book, The Comedians, was written or conceived. I Googled Williams and Rhee and was shocked to see a list of dates that they were playing at county fairs all around North America. They're doing tent shows at noon. They're doing a beer garden at 8 p.m. They're doing a country music festival in rural Saskatchewan. You know, they're still all over playing the road. So Williams and Rhee are sort of the answer to the question nobody has asked, which is, what if a struggling comedian never stops struggling? Mm-hmm. You know, what if there isn't that big break that takes you to the next echelon where you become David Letterman, if you become Jay Leno? What if you just remain the comedian you were playing an open mic in 1974? Williams and Rhee are the answer to that. They just kept doing it, and they have done literally tens of thousands of shows.
Sure, yeah.
And I respect that, and their chemistry is undeniable. Now, their material, however... this is how I would phrase it. Their material is not for me.
Yeah.
And put it that way.
Right.
Because I do respect them and I don't want to malign them in any way. But they do an old school, old fashioned act. And a lot of their jokes are based on ethnic stereotypes, which when they're doing a roadhouse in South Dakota or rural Nevada was acceptable in the 70s. Might still be acceptable in those places today,
sure,
but in the greater scheme of show business would be considered unacceptable. And so they were never a controversial act. They were just too far under the radar in the 70s and 80s. But in recent history, the last 5 years or so, now when they do live events, the younger people in the crowd especially have an immediate aversion and despise it. And they did a show in Saskatchewan, a memorial for a tragic, I'm laughing, a memorial for a tragic bus accident. And they were hired as the MCs, and they did all this racial stereotype material. And there had been a racially motivated killing in that town like a few months earlier that resulted in a very... similar to Trayvon Martin type of court trial with an all-white jury, and the guy who murdered this indigenous kid gets acquitted. And anyways, that was a few months earlier. Then Williams and Rhee, whose whole thing is about ethnic stereotypes, and Bruce Williams, the straight, well, he's they both kind of play off each other. One plays straight to the other, then one's the comedian. They both kind of go back and forth. But Bruce Williams often makes fun of his partner, Terry Rhee, in the act. Terry Rhee, who's Native American, so he'll do quote-unquote Indian jokes. So they were doing that just like a couple years ago at this memorial in Saskatchewan where racial tensions were high, and it created this huge controversy. And, you know, they had to take down all of their social media not because they had said something offensive on social media, but because everybody was threatening to murder them because of what they had said at this memorial, and it turned into this big thing. And the irony is, never in their 52-year career did they ever get more press than when this controversy happened. They were on the front page of the Globe and Mail. There were afternoon drive talk shows taking calls about it all for an hour and a half, and all this stuff. And so I talk about it in the book, just by virtue of hanging around so long. This one-time innocuous, family-friendly, Smothers Brothers-esque act has lived out its welcome to a degree and has been rejected by a whole new generation. So I find that living example really, really interesting. The idea that there's these comedians that have hung around so long that they went from relevant to, maybe irrelevant is the wrong word, they went from being non-controversial to being controversial without changing anything in their act. I find that interesting.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fascinating to kind of live under the radar, but also live in this very particular bubble that suits them perfectly, suits their comedy, suits their work, which, I mean, honestly, just say what you will. I mean, I would have plenty to say if we really wanted to break down the stuff I didn't like, but, say what you will about the actual content. It is interesting to see that stuff, they if you want to make money and you can find a way to live inside this bubble, it's fascinating that it lasted that long anyway.
Well, they did not make money early on. I mean,
sure, yeah.
They made a little bit of money, but the record that we mentioned, not Fuck Buffalo, but the second one, which is called
Feed and Mingle with Live Indians.
Yeah, Feed and Mingle. If you listen to that record, they say, well, the Oak Ridge Boys will be out here in just a few minutes, but we're going to warm you guys up. They're opening for the Oak Ridge Boys, a major country music headliner of the early 1980s, the Oak Ridge Boys. That's when they started making money. They had been hired to open for the Oak Ridge Boys as an emergency replacement. They had been playing Nevada lounges for years and years and years and doing okay. And then whoever was opening for the Oak Ridge Boys, nobody seems to remember who it was contracted to do 20 minutes, and then you bring on the Oak Ridge Boys. Well, whoever the comedian was did an hour, ran the light, as they would say in today's parlance. They did 40 minutes too long, and the Oak Ridge Boys were backstage fuming. So they fired this guy immediately, but they had more shows to do the next night. So they phoned around, and they found this comedy team, Williams and Ree. They were working like down the street or the next town over. They came in, they did 20 polished, tight minutes, killed. Oak Ridge Boys loved them, phoned their agent, said, let's sign these guys to be our permanent opening act, and that's what they became. Once they got hired to open for the Oak Ridge Boys in Vegas, they were getting paid $10,000 a gig. $10,000 well, maybe it wasn't $10,000 a show. I think it was. Maybe it was $10,000 per booking. So maybe Oak Ridge Boys are doing 2 weeks, then you get $10,000 for the 2 weeks.
Right.
But they were making, $10,000 per booking at the time that this record was recorded. So they struggled for a long time. They tried to do Hollywood and the Comedy Store. As good as they did at the Comedy Store, they really weren't a television-friendly act because they did do ethnic stereotypes that were sort of designed to please the audiences in like hard rabble mining towns in Nevada or working-class taverns in South Dakota, a different sensibility than Hollywood. So they didn't really find success there, but once they got hired to open for the Oak Ridge Boys, it led to all these other gigs opening for Tammy Wynette, Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson, every country music star you could name. And once they got into that universe, right around the same time, a television network was being developed for cable. This is still the early years of cable TV. There was a channel they created, that was created called TNN, the Nashville Network.
Sure, yeah.
And their agent said, if you guys move here to Nashville, we could get you all over TNN because they need comedians, for this new TV channel. So that's what they did. They moved to Nashville, and they became regulars on a number of different TNN shows. The Ralph Emery Show, which was like a country music version Johnny Carson. It was like a late night talk show, but just country music, and they'd have comedians. Willie Tyler and Lester were regulars on that show for some reason. Gary Mule Deer was a regular on that show for some reason, and Williams and Rhee were regulars on that show. And then they got hired to appear on the revamp. The TNN relaunched a new version of Hee Haw.
Right.
It was the last 2 years of Hee Haw, I think, and they were trying to like hip it up because it had been on the air for years, and people weren't watching it anymore. And so, if you remember Hee Haw, it was like a ripoff of Laugh-In, but instead of a joke wall where they did one-liners, they had a cornfield where they did one-liners. Well, in order to engage a new, younger audience for the new version of Hee Haw, in which they hired Williams and Rhee as cast members, they got rid of the cornfield and replaced it with a shopping mall bench. And they thought this will bring the young teenagers to watch Hee Haw because it's set at a shopping mall.
Holy shit.
So they had Grandpa Jones and George Lindsay sitting on the bench, and they would do their one-liners like they used to do in the cornfield.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's the version of Hee Haw that Williams and Rhee joined, and Terry Rhee became the first and last Native American cast member of Hee Haw.
Holy shit. If you guys want to hear a story about George Lindsay's testicles, there's one in this book. I feel like it's a good endorsement of...
Yes, the name of the book is We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, The Unheralded Story of Native Americans and Comedy by Kliph Nesteroff, also the author of The Comedians. Available now from Simon & Schuster in hardcover, Kindle, and Audible.
I'm assuming you read it. Or does the deceased George Lindsay read it?
Oh, the audiobook, I read it.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
Although, I wanted to hire like an indigenous narrator.
Sure.
And then I ran out of money. And then they were like, do you want to do the audiobook? We'll pay you, blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. Yep. Fair enough.
There goes
a thing, man.
Yeah. I was going to have all this artistic integrity and like hire an indigenous voice to read it because I felt that would be appropriate. And then realized I couldn't pay the rent in January. So there.
That will happen. Can I tell you, though, I was, for all their content, boy, oh boy, if they aren't polished musicians. Their harmonies are not bad. I really like the music a lot.
Yeah. Terry Rhee he's got a beautiful singing voice. He can do that high range. Yeah. In fact, for a second when you said I thought you were doing an impression of him because it was very high-pitched
It was, yeah.
But yeah, Terry Rhee, I talk about it in the book. He was very influenced by Buck Owens, which is a weird coincidence that he then joined Hee Haw, which Buck Owens was one of the hosts with Roy Clark. But in the 60s, he was very much influenced by Buck Owens. That's what a lot of people were because Buck Owens bridged the gap between traditional country music and what they called the Nashville Sound, which was the new version of country music in the late 60s. It was very controversial. It was a Chet Atkins innovation. And what it was, it brought heavy production values to country music. So it wasn't just the barnyard fiddle anymore. Now there was a string section or a horn section and like lavish overdubs. That was the Nashville Sound. And Buck Owens, who had been a traditional Bakersfield sound guy, Bakersfield was a capital for country music because if you've read The Grapes of Wrath, all the Okies settled in Oklahoma and settled in Bakersfield, and they brought their music with them from Oklahoma. And so Bakersfield became California's capital of country music. And people that came out of there included Merle Haggard, Buck Owens, a guy named Red Simpson, who was known for doing truck driving music, Bob Willis and his Texas swing, Texas Playboys settled in Bakersfield. And there were all these honky-tonks in a row. Anyways, Buck Owens had that traditional background of the Oklahoma sound, but he also was very much a virtuoso on the electric guitar. And so he was one of the people that brought country music into the sort of the pop field. Country in the late 60s had this huge national... It was no longer niche. Country music, which they had called hillbilly music previously, was very niche for many, many years. By the late 60s, it was now on the pop charts, not just the country charts. And Buck Owens had a lot to do with that. So he was a big influence on a lot of people in the late 60s, especially guitar players. So was Roy Clark, by the way, who was a great guitar player. And Terry Rhee, if you listen to his guitar playing, it sounds like Buck Owens. Williams and Rhee would do straight songs in their act sometimes, just like the Smothers Brothers would, and did a lot of Buck Owens numbers. And when you listen to their harmonies, and you're right, they really do know how to harmonize. It's Terry Rhee singing those sort of Buck Owens harmonies. And if you listen to Buck Owens or a Buck Owens fan, the influence is evident when you listen to Williams and Rhee.
Do you know... this strikes me as an act. Williams and Rhee strike me as an act who must have done very well on, it's not a circuit exactly, but there's a whole subsection of comedy, trucker comedy, which is comedy that appeals to truckers or is about trucking, is, somebody plays a trucker. They seem like they would fall in, but I can't imagine a lot of native acts falling into that same category. Or am I wrong? Do you know?
Well, I can't speak to whether native acts fall into that category. Every native act is different.
Sure.
Right? So there might be some that would or some that wouldn't. And really, that genre of so-called truck driving comedy is really just Gene Tracy. I don't know who else falls into that category. This guy, Gene Tracy, was maybe Jerry Clower. These guys were well known. But that was real strategic on Gene Tracy's part. So his records would have the word trucking or trucker in the title, and then they would sell those records at truck stops. They weren't records, they were 8-track tapes.
For sure. Yeah.
For the truck driver to listen to in their rig. I don't know if it's still a thing, but I remember hitchhiking across the country in 1998. The summer of 98, I went from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean and back. And I remember when I got to eastern Canada, New Brunswick, there's a chain there called Irving truck stops, and they had these little kiosks that you would spin around that had cassette tapes, like a vending machine, and you could buy a cassette tape, and they were all sort of geared to what truckers would like, and none of it really had anything to do with trucking. It was random, but at every truck stop it would be the same collection of cassettes. So whoever was in charge of marketing just decided this is what's going to go to the trucking contingent. There was a genre of country music in the late 60s of trucking music. Dave Dudley, Red Sovine, Red Simpson, and then a bunch of other people who were not known for so-called trucking music who did one album with a picture of them behind a big rig, and they would do a cover of Dave Dudley, Truck Driving Son of a Gun. Sure. So presumably Gene Tracy, the comedian, was cashing in on that. But unless you know otherwise, who else would you consider a truck driving comedian? Who else belongs to that genre other than Jerry Clower or Gene Tracy?
I very specifically think of country comedy, so not specifically truck driving, but definitely with an appeal. I know that going to truck stops in the 90s and stuff, I would see, your Jeff Foxworthy, all your blue collar comedy tour guys. There's also, hold on, I feel bad because I interviewed his son. This is a record that Cletus Maggard, it's a one record thing.
Yeah.
Novelty, absolutely novelty, but it is the same dude in 10, 12 different outfits, again, in front of a semi, and all of the music is what you would expect. It's CB comedy, quote unquote, CB music, CB comedy. It's
I don't think they were really I don't think it was really a genre of comedy. It was just a trend in popular culture. So you had Smokey and the Bandit, you had BJ and the Bear. There was a great Claude Akins series. When I say great, I mean entertaining, called Moving On, and had a theme song by Merle Haggard. And it was a trend. The truck driving country music trend started in the mid to late 60s. And then the CB radio craze started in the late 70s. And then you had CB related songs, CB related cartoons. There was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, I think, called CB Bears. This is all trash. And there's some movies, White Line Fever, starring Jan Michael Vincent, and a number of different things. It was a trend in show business. The idea that Jeff Foxworthy has anything to do with country music or truck driving is absurd. And the fact that all you had to do to be defined as country is have a southern accent is bizarre, because that blue collar comedy tour, those guys could play any venue, do any comedy club in the North or in any country, and it would be the same thing. But it's a marketing ploy. You know, you sound like this guy, so watch this guy who has an accent. You know, like you really has nothing to do with the material necessarily.
Sure. Oh no, that's absolutely true. I guess maybe I am just curious then about the marketing part of it. Maybe that could be what you know. Yeah, even Von Meter did I don't think he ever released it, but he did himself put together a CB song as well, a novelty CB song. I don't think he released it. I'd have to.
You know who's a huge Von Meter fan? I had the chance to. It was a brief 15-minute maybe conversation in the makeup room. We were passing each other. I was having my makeup put on. He was having his makeup taken off. But you know who's a huge Von Meter obsessive? Tom Hanks.
I had a feeling you were going to say that. Okay.
Yeah. You had a feeling I was going to say Tom Hanks?
Yeah, because his widow told me that he bought the rights to his story years ago, and I think maybe has kept renewing the rights, but has never done anything with the Von Meter story.
His widow?
Yes, Von Meter's widow. No.
Oh, I think you meant Tom Hanks.
No, not Rita Wilson. Sorry, I didn't want to shock you and make you think Tom Hanks had just died. No, Von Meter's widow told me, that Tom Hanks had bought the rights to Von's story for a while.
You threw me off.
That is fair. Word choice, Jason. Word choice. Yeah. So, I don't know if he still owns the rights or not. I don't know who could play Von Meter. It'd be a weird story because if you listen to her talk about it, it sounds like Von Meter was kind of a monster. She doesn't even realize it, but it kind of sounds like Von Meter was a bit of a monster at the end of the day. Not a good dude.
Oh, really? I know nothing about that.
Yeah. Interesting story. Yeah. So let's. Do you? How many records have you listened to? Did you listen to any records in prep for this book? Did you listen to everybody's material or watch everyone's material?
Yeah, I mean, I was familiar with people's act for the most part. The only person whose act I never saw, he's more of a comedy writer than a performer, is a guy named Joey Kliph. I never saw his act. He produced 2 shows at UCB that were all native themed.
Okay.
2 different years, but I was out of town both times and I missed it both times. So I haven't actually seen him perform, but most of the comedians that are in the book I went and saw in person if I could. There was a series of stand-up specials being taped out in San Bernardino. I took the train out there 6 weeks in a row to see 6 different tapings, and I flew to Oregon to see a sketch troupe called the 1491s do a show. That was fantastic. And then, clips here and there or whatever. The one record I sent a link to you that's out there came out about 12, 13 years ago. It's called the Pow Wow Comedy Jam.
Yeah.
And again, it was an album that was sold at the live shows. These 3 dudes used to tour together, sometimes 4. Mark Yaffe, J.R. Redwater, Jim Rule, and Von Eaglebear. And the clip I sent you was this guy, Von Eaglebear, who's Yakima from Spokane, Washington. And his stand-up is really funny, I think. It's very much... I mean, it's my type of comedy. Like I said, Williams and Rhee aren't for me. Von Eaglebear is for me. Yeah. So we all have our own tastes and favorites. And I just love playful, jokey jokes like Stephen Wright, Emo Phillips, Mitch Hedberg. There's a modern comedian who's done Conan a couple times called Matt Donaher.
Yep.
And that's, I just love that. That's, to me, I love comedy that's playful and just pure joy, just a stupid joke, or maybe it's a smart joke, but just a short joke, a non sequitur. Dimitri Martin, Zach Galifianakis when he does stand up, Rodney Dangerfield. I love that style of comedy. That's my favorite. And so Von Eaglebear does the same style. It's all short jokes, and most of it is sort of indigenous themed. And he toured for a long time with his group, the Pow Wow Comedy Jam. They did casinos around North America. And so there's this CD they put out called Pow Wow Comedy Jam. And you can go on YouTube and listen to Von Eaglebear's set, which is like 15 minutes. I recommend it to people. So that was one. I never saw him perform live, but I heard that. That was one of the few comedy records that I listened to while I was researching the book. I think I even quote from that record in the book.
That's fantastic. What was maybe the biggest revelation in doing the research? It sounds like you knew a ton about it already, but you need to get it down on paper. You need to get a lot of details there. And obviously a ton of this shit surprised me and kind of blew me away. And I liked reading very much about how Williams and Rhee just had this sort of typical trajectory for American comedians, but I'd still never heard of them. Was there anything that really surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, all of it. The great thing about writing a book or being a quote-unquote expert is that people assume that you know everything already.
Sure.
When the reality is you researched it yourself like an hour earlier, and then now we're talking like you've known about it all along. So you say that it sounds like I knew a lot about it already. I didn't know anything that I wrote about in this book already.
Okay.
It was all brand new to me for the most part. I had... like I say, informed by my own surroundings in Canada, and moving to the States. Not that makes me any more informed, but it gives me a perspective of here's what it looks like when Indigenous people have representation in media. Here's what it looks like when they do not, going from Canada to America. And Canada has been very poor to its First Nations peoples over the course of history. They've been horrific, genocidal. So can't pretend that Canada is somehow superior, but in terms of sovereignty and awareness and Indigenous empowerment, things are a little bit further ahead in Canada than they are in the United States, just a little bit. So that point of view was already there for me. But the actual knowledge of what I ended up writing about and now presenting to the readership was pretty much all new. In terms of what was the most surprising, there's a story in the book. I talk a lot about Will Rogers, and I heard Katie talking about Will Rogers on your show. He has always been sold to us as this figure that was beloved by all. The all-American, down-home, simple American, the simple Oklahoma cowboy, never met a man he didn't like, he's just treated like this deity that most of us today know nothing about.
Right.
So all we learn is this sort of propaganda version. He's Native American. You would think that would be the very first thing that would be mentioned when people mention Will Rogers, that he's this major Indigenous star in an era when there was no such thing. Today, there's still barely such a thing as a major Indigenous star in the United States. So the fact that he was that influential and that famous, so famous that today we still know his name.
Yeah.
There's hospitals and museums and parks and highways that still bear his name, Will Rogers. But we don't know that he's Native American. That's astounding to me. So I dove into the history of Will Rogers and his Indigenous background and kind of tried to reframe him as a more complicated figure than is sold to us. Because they always use that word simple when describing Will Rogers. Here's a guy who was Native American in the 1800s and then becomes one of the most influential voices in the world. How is any part of that equation simple? It's so complicated.
Yeah. Such
a complex person and figure and circumstance. So I knew that this version of Will Rogers that I'd heard about could not be the whole story any more than George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and not being able to tell a lie is the full story of George Washington. So everything I learned about Will Rogers was pretty surprising. And I was framing him as this sort of important figure in modern, quote-unquote, modern Native American history. The surprising part was that about 2/3 of the way through building up his story, I found out about this insane controversy he was involved with 1 year before his death that was so insane that I had to have conversations with my editor about it where he was like, are you sure you want to include...
Oh, shit. Okay.
Are you sure you want to include this story? And I said, yeah, I do, because it's so timely and nobody knows about it. He goes, yeah, but it sort of undercuts your whole premise because you're building him up as this heroic figure and then you tell this story which is going to undercut it. I said, yeah,
Sure.
let's put it in there anyways. So
Yeah.
the story is Will Rogers, at the height of his fame, he's a top 5 box office star under contract to Fox, making movies for John Ford. He's got a widely syndicated newspaper column 5 days a week. It's read in over 800 papers. I think at its height, maybe even over 2,000 newspapers around the world at its height. He's a well-known Broadway fixture. Everybody knows the name Will Rogers, blah, 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 blah. And he's under contract to the Shell Oil Company to do 3 radio shows on network radio. And that record that Katie shared with you on your show is derived from these radio broadcasts he did for Shell Oil. He did 3 different shows, one called the Shell Chateau, and I forget the other 2, but they're all Shell something something. On one of those broadcasts, 1934, January, he is introducing a Western song, I think called The Roundup, the something Roundup. It was like a cowboy song.
Mm-hmm.
He plays the song, and then Will Rogers says, it might be a cowboy song, but it's really just an N-word spiritual to me. Now, I'm cleaning it up. I'm saying N-word, but he said the word.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people heard that, and they're like, wait, excuse me? Did he just say that? And some people, it was on the radio. It just goes by in a blip. So you think, well, maybe I misheard, or maybe he misspoke.
Sure. Just
in case you thought that was the case, he repeats himself and uses the N-word 3 more times.
Oh my.
So it turns into this huge controversy. The switchboard lights up.
Mm-hmm.
NBC is in trouble. Shell Oil is like, what's up? Even in 1934, you could not say that word on the radio. Certainly not on the radio. And even that early on, all the networks already had a list of taboos, and one of them was racial slurs, specifically that racial slur. So you could say, it was the era, but it wasn't. Nobody else was going on the radio and using the N-word unless it was like a local Ku Klux Klan broadcast in Memphis.
Sure.
This was national coast-to-coast NBC radio, sponsored by Shell Oil, starring the most famous person in America, Will Rogers. So he uses the N-word 3 times, maybe 4 times on this broadcast. And Shell Oil goes into damage control. They said, you got to go on the air next week and apologize, because we're getting a lot of heat from the NAACP. And there was a letter-writing campaign and a bunch of editorials in the black press, the major African-American newspapers of the era, the New York Age, the New York Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender. These were the leading black newspapers. They all talked about it and said this was an insult to black people everywhere. How dare Will Rogers? He better apologize. So he comes on the air the next week on the Shell Chateau, or whatever the Shell-sponsored radio show was, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, you people who got upset are making entirely too much out of this. You got to look at the intent behind the words. I meant no harm by using the N-word. I've never had any prejudice because I was raised by darkies.
Oh, boy.
That's what he said.
Oh, shit.
To make up for it.
Oh, boy. Will.
So then Shell Oil was like, what are you doing? People are going to boycott our product. What are you doing? That's not what we asked you to do. You got to apologize, not make it worse. And so then when he said that, it did make things worse. And a major boycott campaign was organized in New York, pleading with all black people to boycott all Shell gas stations, all Shell oil products, to boycott all Will Rogers movies screening in Fox theaters. And the boycott also succeeded in having multiple theaters in black neighborhoods, Harlem in particular, canceling all screenings of Will Rogers films. They were pulled from theaters. And these were like major movies that people were lining up to see. And one of the editorial writers in the New York Age said, now, if we don't get an apology now, the next step is to further the boycott to all Fox films. Wow. So that would include all the Shirley Temple movies. Any Fox film must be boycotted, right? So that was the next phase. And there's a real harsh editorial which I did quote in the book. I actually had trepidation about quoting it. I was like, should I quote this? I don't really want the N-word in my book, and I definitely don't want to have to type it. But it appeared in this editorial in a black newspaper, the New York Age, in 1934, and because it was not ellipsed in the original, and I think the reason they didn't put N-word in the newspaper itself was because they wanted to have the impact.
Sure.
A black editorial writer wrote at the end of his screed about how we have to boycott Fox Films, he said, "We are N-words to Will Rogers," and he put N-word in like capital. He either said we are or we might be. We might be N-words to Will Rogers, and then he put this operative word in caps. But he is trash to us. So that was sort of the thing. And then the white press didn't really pay much attention to this, but it was heavily covered in the black press. And then not barely a year later, maybe it was 14 months later, he dies in a fiery plane crash. And this controversy is completely erased from the history books and never mentioned again. Wow. So you would think that, again, Will Rogers, this very famous name that we still know the name of, if not about him, you would think that a man mentioned so often that you would know immediately that he's Native American, and that you would know immediately that he was embroiled in this N-word controversy, and yet both of those things seem to be missing from most books about Will Rogers. So those are some of the things, I guess, to answer your question. What surprised me the most?
Yeah, that's holy shit, man. I can't wait to get to that part of the book. Wow. That's freaking... You know, that was one of those things when Katie brought that record up. I was like, well, I should probably dig in because I think I know him, but I only know him on the surface, and obviously only dug so much. But having had no idea that he was Native American, I was just like, what the fuck? Why did no one tell me this? Why was this never an issue?
And the weird thing is there's like dozens and dozens and dozens of books about Will Rogers. Like there's a book just about him and the plane crash, and there's a book just about him in vaudeville, and there's a book just about him on Broadway, and a book written by his wife, and a book written by his screenwriter, and a book written by his friend, and, you know, all these different books about Will Rogers. One just about political humor, one just about, you know, and very few of them mention any of his indigenous background. You know, it's all surface level. They all just rely on that same conceit, the simple homespun, all American, blah, blah, blah. They just kind of gloss over the brass tacks. There's one fantastic book about him, if you do read a book about him other than what I've written, just called Will Rogers, a Biography by Ben Yagoda. It's from the 90s, and that does include a lot of this information. And it is an excellent book, and it does not simplify him. There's a lot more nuance to that book, and you learn about the history of his father and his grandfather. His grandfather was murdered in a vengeance killing, and then his father was not murdered, but he himself had two people murdered. Like, it's just a really interesting family tree. But that book, Will Rogers, a Biography by Ben Yagoda, is worth reading, and then the other 100 books about Will Rogers that I flipped through in the research are not worth reading at all.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I think the one I have is like entitled Will Rogers, an autobiography, and I haven't read through it because I just know that it's just going to be what a bunch of fun quotes from this guy that we're not going to dig into at all.
Yeah, it's called that book. I like that book, but the weird thing about that book is that it's not his autobiography. Like, he didn't write it. It's a compendium of stuff categorized in different thematically from his newspaper columns. So these two editors took stuff out of his newspaper columns and arranged it by category, and then published it as Will Rogers, an Autobiography. And I think at one point there was like a lawsuit over that book because it was misrepresenting what it was. And then there was also an accusation. It's actually not a bad book, but I'd also heard accusations to the effect that there's quotes in that book that he did not say.
Oh boy.
But there's a lot of confusion around Will Rogers because they did sort of rebrand who he was in the year 1952. I don't go into this in the book because it's too off the track, but Will Rogers, they made a movie about him in 1952, long after he died, which stars his son, Will Rogers Jr., Warner Brothers put it out. It's called The Will Rogers Story. And in conjunction with the movie, to promote it, they put out all this extra Will Rogers stuff, and there was sort of like a Will Rogers resurgence in the 1950s. And if you pay attention to what was happening in 1952, this is the time that One Nation Under God and In God We Trust is added to all the money and added. And it's also when the Pledge of Allegiance becomes compulsory in elementary schools. So there was this sort of shift towards this God and country model instead of the separation of church and state. This was the first era in which Billy Graham starts visiting the White House and leading prayers on the White House lawn. There was this sort of piety, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Boom. Mm-hmm. Has anybody ever used that phrase before?
Don't think so, but I like it.
A piety boom in the 1950s as a counteraction to the boogeyman known as godless communism.
Sure.
So suddenly everything in America became very godly. And so the Will Rogers Story comes out in 1952, and they dedicate a park to him in Beverly Hills called Will Rogers Park. They dedicate Route 66 to him and rename it the Will Rogers Highway. And the Postal Service puts out a commemorative stamp, a Will Rogers stamp. And on that stamp, they used a quote from an old newspaper column, but the whole quote was too long, so they lobbed off the beginning and they lobbed off the end, and the quote that's on the stamp became the most famous thing that Will Rogers ever said, which was, "Never met a man I didn't like."
Right.
And the reason that phrase is famous today is not because it gained traction when he wrote it in the 20s, but because it was on that stamp in 1952. So Will Rogers, there was a resurgence. There was a comedian in the 50s named Herb Schreiner, who was from Indiana. And he had the same delivery and tone and style as Will Rogers. There was another guy named Bob Lewis, who you can see YouTube clips of on Ed Sullivan. Same thing. They did this sort of self-effacing, aw shucks, kind of looking at their shoes while they did their jokes type of performance. All sort of inspired by Will Rogers and this Will Rogers resurgence. And then, not to make this story so long, but in the late 60s, James Whitmore, the actor, did a one-man show. It was inspired by the success of Hal Holbrook, who had done a one-man show as Mark Twain. James Whitmore did a one-man show as Will Rogers. And he was going to play Will Rogers and talk like Will Rogers and deliver the material that Will Rogers had done in the 20s and 30s. During the tryouts of this one-man show, they found that the material that was supposed to be so funny wasn't landing. The audience was not resonating. It just didn't resonate with the audience, this material that Will Rogers had done. So James Whitmore and the people involved in the production punched it up. And there's a bunch of stuff in there that got laughs when James Whitmore delivered it as Will Rogers in his one-man show, which Will Rogers never said. So today, when you Google famous quotes from Will Rogers, a lot of the quotes are actually James Whitmore as Will Rogers on Broadway quotes, but not things that Will Rogers ever said. Probably the most famous of which is, "We have the best Congress money can buy." That's something that Will Rogers never said, but James Whitmore as Will Rogers in the one-man show in the late 60s did say. So anyways, the whole history of Will Rogers is anything but simple.
I'd like to use that show to tie back to your first appearance on this show, which is one person who claimed to have been screwed out of playing Will Rogers in that show was Dick Davey.
Oh, really?
Yes, his widow told me he was really pissed that he didn't get to play somebody. Who was it? We looked it up, and it was Will Rogers in exactly that show. That's amazing that just to rewrite someone's entire history to serve the audience. I get why you do it. Money's been invested in this show, but it's so dishonest.
Well, I mean, that's still that's show business, though.
Yeah.
Isn't there a show or a movie that's nominated for an Oscar in which Malcolm X meets with Sam Cooke, right? It's like all the famous black celebrities meeting in a hotel room that they never actually met. It's all fictional dialogue. But, I mean, so what? I mean, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it has an ending that is not the real ending of what happened in real life. And so what? Showbiz is show business. I always find it weird when people complain about a biopic that isn't true to reality. Of course it's not. It's only 2 hours long.
Uh-huh.
The person's life was 50 years. So of course it's not exactly as it happened. That's show business. You don't want it to be boring, right?
Sure. Just when it obviously in a time where information was less valued, less of a commodity as it is now, it's interesting how much of that then leaches out there as, oh no, well, he must have said it. Well, it's because you took their word for it. That's interesting. That's fascinating to me. I would like, okay, so you do not have to, but why recommend these Williams and Rhee albums to people?
Well, first of all, you got to put a photo up on your podcast page of the first record.
Oh, yeah.
Buck Fuffalo, because they apparently had a bad gig in Buffalo, and so obviously the play on words, fuck Buffalo, it's called Buck Fuffalo, and the cover has the most sort of like 70s family restaurant font as the title, and then the photo of them with these long like 70s collars showing a little bit of chest hair, just looking very much the lounge act that they were. If you found this in a thrift store for 50 cents and don't buy it for 50 cents,
yeah,
I mean, how square are you not to see the incredible camp value in this cover? Your interest would be immediately piqued if you saw this record. You wouldn't know immediately that it's a comedy record, but the title alone, Buck Fuffalo, come on, we could admit that's funny. And the image of them on the cover is enough to sell you. And, I mean, that's it. And apparently they had to pull every copy. They sold this for a very brief amount of time, but they had plugged their recording machine into their own amplifier. And then when it was released, I guess you couldn't hear it very well. So most of the audio is muffled.
Jesus Christ.
And they sold it at their shows, but pretty quickly they had to do a new album because nobody could hear what they were saying on this one.
I can't wait to get a copy of this. I cannot wait. They have fake quotes on the back from Charles Manson and Bertrand Russell and David Berkowitz, Ed McMahon. A bunch of fake quotes on the back. It's all handwritten. Holy shit. Yeah, no, I mean, come on. Agreed. Yeah. It's an experiment. If nothing else, it's just grab it. It's cheap. I'll tell you. You can get it for $10 on Discogs. I don't know if it's worth $10, but that's what's going to happen.
Absolutely. And really, I got to say, I interviewed Terry Rhee from Williams and Rhee for the book, and very generous with his time. Great guy, really sweet guy, very talented man, very smart. Like I said, they have great chemistry. They do a cheesy act, I guess you would say. It's kind of a corny act. And again, some of the material will make you cringe, especially if you're a younger person.
For sure.
And so it's not an endorsement of any of that. But at the same time, just interesting. It's an interesting act. Any way you look at it, whether you find them hilarious, whether you find them horrendous, whether you find them smart, whether you find them corny, I find them interesting. And to me, that is all that matters, really, when I write about anybody. It's not that they're my favorite comedian or my least favorite comedian. It's that their story is interesting. And if their story is boring, then I don't care. So Will Rogers, same thing, really. How hard is Will Rogers going to make you laugh in the year 2021? Probably not at all.
No.
But his backstory, his trajectory, quite compelling. And so Williams and Rhee, their story, very, very interesting to me.
It's fucking fascinating. And the behind the scenes of the very specific things that you're talking about are great. And just hearing him call what's his name, who worked for The Tonight Show, an alcoholic, was pretty great. Just
Jim McCauley.
Thank you. There we go. There's the name. I honestly, there's also one other thing, and this is just by way of context and not to justify the use of any of the ethnic comedy, whatever. It's their thing. Every comedy album that I own from a certain period during that, especially from the 50s up to the 70s and 80s, that has terrible ethnic humor that I hate, it's all being delivered exclusively by a single white man. At the very least, this is interesting because one of the gentlemen is the furthest thing from that, and and it is this mutual agreement that these two guys are going to do this thing, and it's again interesting, and that's why I'm so fascinated with this pair.
Right, he's Native American, and yet in the act there's sort of anti-Native American stereotypes that are delivered throughout it. And that in itself is controversial, especially in indigenous communities. It's like, what kind of a message are you sending to non-natives that it's okay to use these slurs? Because there's a joke on the LP that something to the effect of, I won't even give the punchline, I'll just give you the setup. The setup is, what do you call an Indian with a IQ of 100? Okay, so it's like a racist street joke delivered by an act that is one Native American dude and one white dude. Okay, now, is it okay? The performer on stage is Native American, but you know full well that performing as the opening act for the Oak Ridge Boys, there's an audience there full of white people that will remember that joke and then repeat it to their white friends later, right? So that's the sort of caveat. Like, what kind of harm could you potentially be doing? Are you giving license to these white people then to repeat a racist joke among themselves and perpetuate those same racist stereotypes? And does that also give them the justification? Oh, well, I heard it from an act that's Native American, so it's okay. It's like the old debate about the football mascot. White people, well, I'm 136th Cherokee and I'm not offended. It's like, no, you're not. If you're not part of that community, then you don't really have a say in the matter. So anyways, there's all kinds of complicated things floating around Williams and Rhee, which is another reason that I find them interesting and ripe for my completely irrelevant study.
Yeah, you've just legitimately given me the first time to actually have complicated feelings about this type of material. So that's why I'm glad you introduced me to them. Like, it's never ever complicated before this. I love it. I'm interested in it.
Well, the other thing is it never used to be complicated for them.
For sure.
And, in their second decade in show business, it was fine. But by their fifth decade in show business, for a huge swath of the population, because their audience, Williams and Rhee, are around 70 years old now, their audience is around the same age. So audiences are only going to be younger, which means their material is only going to be more rejected. And I find that evolution or progression or whatever it is quite fascinating.
Yeah. This is great. People, please pick up the book. It's entitled "We Had a Little Real Estate Problem: The Unheralded Story of Native Americans in Comedy" by a gentleman, a Canadian, Kliph Nesteroff. Neither of those are mutually exclusive things. I just want to make sure people know you're a gentleman and you're Canadian.
Well, I like the gentleman part. You don't have to push the Canadian part.
Last time you were on, did we talk Canadian content regulations at all? Because I feel like I'd be neglecting my show if I didn't ask you your thoughts on it.
Well, it's been defanged, so I don't know how new your information is, but the Canadian content regulations today are not as strict as they were 20 years ago. They changed them drastically when Stephen Harper was the prime minister, and Stephen Harper was the most American of Canadian prime ministers in recent memory. He was the guy that, before he was prime minister, he was leader of the opposition, and in 2003, he wrote an open letter to the Wall Street Journal on behalf of all Canadians, apologizing because then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien did not join the United States in the invasion of Iraq, in the Iraq War. Wow. So he apologized. On behalf of all Canadians, we should have gone to Iraq. In 2003, he wrote that editorial, and then I guess 3 years later, he was elected Prime Minister of Canada. So he was very American in his sensibility about deregulation, privatization, opening things up for American corporations to come and invest, and that's when the tar sands oil boom happened in Alberta. I don't know if you're aware, the largest oil field on Earth is in Canada, and it was developed times 1,000 under Prime Minister Harper because they removed a lot of environmental regulations, and the Koch brothers, who are famous in America, their largest investments were in those oil fields in northern Alberta, thanks to Prime Minister Harper. So in that same realm, he fought to remove those Canadian content regulations, which were, instated in the 1960s to stop Canadian television and radio from becoming too Americanized and to hopefully build up a Canadian show business infrastructure. Unfortunately, I don't know who was in charge of the playlists, but there was an awful lot of Canadian music and performance that never was broadcast. That you could still find like cool old records from the 60s where you're like, wow, this is Canadian, what a great song. Never got any radio play. But then there's other shit, you know, the Avril Lavignes and the Nickelbacks and the Bryan Adams and the Corey Harts, who are like non-stop exposure, their own TV special, their own Christmas special, their own, you know, 12 times a day, the same song on the radio.
Yeah.
So in theory, Canadian content was well-meaning, but in execution, I think they had some old fuddy-duddy curating what got played and not. You know, Wayne and Schuster. I don't know if you've had any of their comedy records on your show, but Wayne and Schuster were like Canada's only comedians. But they weren't. There was like all these other comedians. They were the only comedians allowed on TV for like 30 years.
Funny.
The taxpayer subsidized this fucking shit comedy team, which I loved them when I was 4.
Sure.
But by the time I was 15, I was like, oh, okay, so...
I think people weren't happy with me for not liking their album. That I'm like, I guess I get that. I didn't even know they were Canadian when I first dug it out. And it's like,
Which one?
Do It, if I remember correctly, is the name of it. Let me look it up. Hold on. I think that's the name.
Do it.
I'm pretty sure that's the... Hold on. Let me make sure. I could be thinking of a different comedy team, but I know I've heard... Hold on. Give me 1 second.
They have 2 records, one called Wayne Schuster Short Subjects and one Wayne Schuster live in comedy performance. Again, I think it comes down to like media propaganda, like Will Rogers is Simple. Wayne and Schuster were sold to the public as like highbrow. Like they're Canadian and more intellectual than the American comedy teams like Allen and Rossi.
Okay.
And one of the 2 reasons they were considered quote unquote intellectuals because one of their sketches was about Shakespeare, and then their other sketch was about ancient Rome, and the sketch about ancient Rome has one joke in it that was like the toast of like intellectuals.
Oh my God.
But it's a very labored joke. It actually works better on paper than out loud. But they always inserted this joke. It was like their greatest hit. They did it on Ed Sullivan multiple times. So they're in ancient Rome, and there's a private eye trying to investigate the death of Brutus or whatever. I don't know Roman history or Roman... I think that's the story, right? And so the guy goes to a bar to order a drink, and it's ancient Rome, and he says to the bartender, he says, I'll have a Martinez with an olive. And the bartender goes, a Martinez? You mean martini? He goes, if I want 2, I'll ask for it.
Jesus Christ.
So that's the big joke. Instead of Martinez, martini, if I want 2, I'll ask for it. So that was like their big famous joke. And that joke was like the example that they were like cerebral. And Ed Sullivan loved them. He would most comedians had their act cut down to ribbons. You got 6 minutes, now you have to do 3, right before you go on. Wayne and Schuster were the opposite. Ed Sullivan let them do sketches that lasted 15 minutes. And if you think back to the first season of SNL, there's no such thing as a good 15-minute sketch.
Nope.
15-minute sketch is a too long a sketch, no matter what. That's too long. So that showed. And they never really gained traction in the States, even though they were under contract to CBS and did a Jack Benny summer replacement in 1960 or 61.
Interesting.
But even if you have a little bit of a success in the States, you can then go back to Canada and it's like you're a god.
Okay.
It's like, oh my God, they cracked the ceiling in America and America liked them, so now we'll give you your own TV series for the next 40 years.
That's remarkable. I'm supposed to be listening. I'm sorry. I don't want to keep you, but in terms of Canadian comedy, have you ever heard the Lorne and Hart album? I have a digital copy, but I've not listened to it yet. What are your thoughts? Is it good?
There's a very racist track on it.
Oh, really?
Called... I forget what the track is called. It might just be called, like, The Indian.
Aha. Ooh, fun.
It's from the late 60s, and as has been established in this episode, First Nations issues are front and center in Canada, and the history and treatment of First Nations peoples in Canada by Canada is comparable to the Holocaust in Germany. And I'm not overstating it. Like in Canada, that's well accepted, and there's a national day of mourning in Canada now to remember the victims of residential school abuse, blah, 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 blah. So that Lauren and Hart LP, the Lorne Michaels Comedy LP, I think it's from 1970, and it was released internally by the CBC to play on the radio to promote their TV show. It was never released commercially.
Okay.
So if you look at the cover of it, the front cover, it is the word ha 4 times. It says ha, 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 ha. It doesn't even say Lauren and Hart on the front cover. It's like a green and blue cover. And that was the front cover that was generic for all internal CBC comedy releases. And then on the back, there's photos of Lorne Michaels and Hart Pomerantz and the track listings. And so there's this one track, I guess it's called The Indian or something like that. The copy that I found was at the Vancouver CBC radio record library. And in those days, they had their entire vinyl library still. They'd been, like a major radio station like the BBC. They received one copy of every record ever released, basically. So they had well over 100,000 LPs in this library. Found the Lorne Michaels LP, and on the back it has the track listings, ba-ba-ba-ba, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. And then some disc jockey took a Jiffy marker and underlined, which tracks to play. There's an arrow pointing to the one that says The Indian, and it says, "Do not play on air! Do not play on air!" Underline, underline, underline. So when you listen to it, it's a lot of "ugh, me too, white man, look for," a lot of that Western movie stereotypes. So very much of its era. Lorne Michaels is the straight man in the comedy team, and Hart Pomerantz is the comedian who does all the different characters. And of course, the Wayne and Schuster connection. Wayne and Schuster are Lorne Michaels' father-in-law. Frank Schuster is the father of Rosie Schuster, who was Mrs. Lorne Michaels and one of the first writers of SNL, Rosie Schuster. So Frank Schuster from Wayne and Schuster, kind of mentored his son-in-law, Lorne Michaels. And when he had his own CBC variety show, the Hart and Lorne Hour, it was very much the new generation version of Wayne and Schuster. And so there's a very important connection there in terms of comedy history. And, Lorne Michaels is such a key to the history of Canadian comedy and the history of comedy as a whole now. But his lineage is connected, his ex-wife is connected, and then all the Canadians that have come since then out of the SNL factory, whether it's Dan Aykroyd or Mike Myers or Phil Hartman or all the people that were inspired by those people who are around today, everybody from Nathan Fielder to Seth Rogen to Michael Cera to Samantha Bee to Anthony Antimick, a lot of people that, Jim Carrey, all these people that add up, you forget how many Canadians there are, all to a degree inspired or informed by the Lorne Michaels connection somewhere in that puzzle. So Wayne and Schuster, as much as I deride them, are integral to the history of Canadian comedy.
That's fascinating. All right, I'm going to re-listen just to remember why I didn't like it, and be prepared to judge the Hart and Lorne album because holy shit.
Norm Macdonald did a Netflix series recently, or last year, I guess. Go watch some Wayne and Schuster on YouTube.
Okay.
And then go back and watch his Netflix series, or at least the end of each episode. Norm Macdonald, who's Canadian, does a hat tip to Wayne and Schuster at the end of every episode. Again, it would go over the head of any American. It would hit you right in the face if you're Canadian. Wayne and Schuster closed every episode with a song that they had written for the show while the end credits roll. They'd wear tuxedos. The band would do this walking bass line, and they would go into this thing about, "Well, I see by the clock on the wall, it's time to say to one and all, goodbye, goodbye, farewell, farewell, so long, stay loose, adieu, adieu." They would do this back and forth song. And Norm Macdonald ends his Netflix show with that same song. At the end of every episode, he goes to the camera and he sings this stupid song while his guest can be seen in the background looking confused and mystified. But it's the Wayne and Schuster theme song.
Okay.
So even to this day, Norm Macdonald, a Canadian comedian, is giving a hat tip to that important history of Canadian comedy. Because really, for my entire childhood, the only comedy you were allowed to watch, the only comedy on Canadian TV was the Wayne and Schuster show. It used to come on right before Hockey Night in Canada, the number one TV show in the country.
Sure.
The little comedy variety leading into the Maple Leafs game. So those things are like very much part of the Canadian fabric. They're fun to make fun of and they're fun to revisit, but because Canadians only had one TV channel, or at the most two, for decades, didn't matter what coast you grew up on, we all collectively grew up with the same sort of visual cues and regional references and sort of this Canadian shorthand, so that if you migrate to Los Angeles, whether you're from Vancouver or whether you're from St. John's, Newfoundland, which are like 4,000, 5,000 miles apart, you still have this connected common language that you understand.
Right. That's fascinating. Kliph, thank you for doing the show, as always.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you guys for listening. And as always, have a good thing. Comedy on Vinyl is a production of StolenDress Entertainment. It is produced by Mike Warden and is hosted and edited by Jason Klom. Our theme song was composed and performed by Richard Levinson. You can email us at podcast@comedyonvinyl.com. You can also send snail mail to StolenDress Entertainment, P.O. Box 805, Burbank, California, 91503. Subscribe to Comedy on Vinyl on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else you can find podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and write us a review. It helps. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Comedy on Vinyl, or find everything in one place at comedyonvinyl.com. A major portion of Comedy on Vinyl has been underwritten by Stand Up Records. Please visit standuprecords.com for all your comedy needs and tune in to the new Stand Up Records channel available on the Roku, where you can also find select episodes of this podcast. Visit StolenDress.com to listen to our other podcasts, watch videos, and imbibe freely of our multimedia content going back 15 plus years. StolenDress Entertainment.
Hey, it's my turn.